Good morning, everybody. Welcome on this Friday afternoon in July to the Casita Coalition's Best Practice webinar series, where we highlight the innovations that are happening at the local level throughout California to improve ADU practices, streamlining, and enable more of this very naturally affordable green infill housing form. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our major financial sponsors for the program, including Union Bank and Facebook, and also our sponsors, including Cross Country Mortgage, Umpqua Bank Home Loans, the Building Industry Association of the Bay Area, the Bridge Association of Realtors, Alan Matkins, and our newest sponsor, Housing Trust Silicon Valley. And then also to thank all of our promotional partners. At the Casita Coalition, we believe in working in coalition with others who have a similar vision of how to improve the life for future Californians, including California State Department of Housing and Community Development, UC Berkeley's Turner Center, the Association of Bay Area Governments, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, the Southern California Association of Governments, Build It Green, the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals, the Bay Area Council, SPUR, Faith LA, California Planning Roundtable, California YIMBY, and Circulate San Diego. These promotional sponsors are helping us share the word about the best practice webinar series during the summer slowdown, and also to just really keep ADUs and small housing forms out in the public eye as a really important source of solution sets for the California housing crisis, which remains unabated and worsening even as time goes on. So all of our work together is very important for the future of our state and our families and communities. And we are grateful for all of you in attendance, as well as all of the folks who make this webinar series possible. We've been busy at the Casita Coalition with our many volunteers in working groups, tackling topics like codes and construction, local government implementation, particular confusion areas like what is a garage conversion? Or how do I find money? What kind of money is out there to build my ADU? So if you're interested in doing the day-to-day work of removing barriers to ADUs and small housing forms, please reach out to us at the Casita Coalition and let us know if you want to participate in a working group. And then this morning, I'm really excited to welcome Senator Nancy Skinner, who has been one of the most innovative and productive senators, former assembly member in the state of California. Senator Skinner currently chairs the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee and is vice chair of the Women's Caucus, but her bills are not limited to her committee leadership positions. She most recently took care of getting SB 206, the Fair Pay to Play Act, meaning all athletes are entitled to compensation for the work they do, which created a groundswell of support for supporting student athletes around the country. Senator Skinner has been very innovative in prison reform issues. She's helping taking care of California's budgeting issues by creating the internet sales tax, and also really a leader in the housing and environmental space, where Senator Skinner authored early ADU bills when she was in the Senate and was instrumental in the behind the scenes work to getting all of the ADU bills that have been adopted by the state of California through both houses of the legislature and having them signed by the governor. So we are really grateful for Senator Skinner's work on ADUs, on housing policy in general, where she's been a real leader, and also all of the other good things she does for Californians from all walks of life. So with that introduction, I'm pleased to introduce one of my favorite elected officials and also a very dear friend, Senator Nancy Skinner. Welcome, Senator Skinner.
Thank you, Denise. Pleased to be part of this morning's webinar, and really glad that the Casita Coalition exists because, as Denise pointed out, and you all are familiar, the legislature over the last, say, 5 years, maybe 6 years, has been greatly opening the door for ADUs and JDUs on properties, residential properties throughout California, even with those local governments who may have been resistant. And that's great. And we know that when we look at the data, and yay for the Turner Center and Casita for tracking this data, we see that the number of ADUs constructed and permits pulled just keeps growing and growing and growing. And in some jurisdictions like San Jose and LA, for example, they are the largest number of permits being pulled for housing. So while we know that ADUs are not the only solution to California's housing crisis, thank goodness we have something that is so practical and that we are able to get through without, I'm afraid if we were to try the laws, Mr. Ting's and Mr. Wykowski's laws, I was co-author on those, or, I actually was one of the real authors of them, but their names are first, but whatever. If we were to try those laws today, I'm afraid with the amount of NIMBY, and when I say amount of, I mean it's amplified. It's not, in my opinion, really representative of the population of California, but they've been very clever at amplifying their voices. And by that amplification, they may have been able to even whack back our progress on ADUs. So I'm so glad that we did it when we did it, and that it's progressing now. And that you all are continuing to hold webinars like this to help our jurisdictions and others just continue to facilitate the construction of the permitting and the construction of these ADUs. Now, in my hat as the budget chair, this is something that we tried last year, but last year, when the beginning of the pandemic, when California was feeling that it may face a huge deficit, we weren't able to put forward many new programs or money to support this kind of activity. But we started to conceptualize, and this was Assemblymember Ting, Senator Hertzberg, and myself. We began to conceptualize a ADU financing program. Now, some of you may be familiar that back in 2019, the state authorized $19 million for our California Housing Finance Authority, CalHFA, to begin to help support financing ADUs. I was a bit disappointed with that program. They chose to pilot it in pretty much one community only, and it was a community that didn't, while everywhere in California has need for housing, this particular community was not as an acute need as many of our other jurisdictions, so they didn't see much take up. So this caused the finance folks to think, well, maybe there's no real interest in this. But fortunately, Casita Coalition, Turner Center, others showed and demonstrated that no, there is great interest, and there are many homeowners who would like to pursue an ADU, but the financing is difficult. And we know that the lenders don't necessarily calculate your anticipated rent until you actually have the ADU constructed, which hurts your ability to get, some people's ability to get financing. You can have other homeowners who don't have great credit, though they have really high equity. And so we thought, all right, we need a more robust program to help finance ADUs. So in this budget that we just adopted, the 21-22, we added $81 million additional dollars so that we have $100 million to support homeowners build ADUs. And we've empowered the treasurer, the California State Treasurer, and HCD to develop a program that would be primarily focused on assisting low-income homeowners or homeowners that otherwise would not qualify for the normal ADU financing type programs, so that we can get more ADUs. So I was really, really happy that we were successful in putting that in. And I look to the Casita Coalition to interact closely with the Treasurer's Office and HCD in developing that, because we want to make sure it gets developed right and that we don't have the flaws in it that occurred with the original HFA program. And then lastly, I just wanted to say there's another bill that's moving through the legislature right now. My pro tem, the head of the state Senate, Tony Atkins' bill, SB 9. There's a lot of misinformation about SB 9. SB 9 is it conceivably would allow far more duplexes. However, its impact, as the Turner Center reports, and they have a great report right now, and that report not only covers SB 9, but also the entire picture of ADUs, where they've estimated that there's the potential for 1.8 million more ADUs just with the legislation we have right now, and they're market feasible. But they also estimate that SB 9 would create the opportunity for, and I say only, and I don't mean to indicate that this is, hey, everything helps, but it's 700,000 units statewide. So when you look at the fear mongering around that bill, they're acting like, every single family parcel in the entire state of California would somehow, be exploited to be split and turn into a duplex. But in fact, the way the bill is drafted, Turner Center estimates 700,000, and that's only if it's optimally taken up and implemented. So we still need those 700,000 units. So I hope the bill is successful. And obviously our pro tem is going to work hard on it. But its real primary impact will be, as the Turner Center indicates, to unlock more units on parcels that are already financially feasible for this purpose. So with that, I'll end, and really happy that you exist, that you're holding these webinars, that you're promoting ADUs and more housing in general in California. And I really thank you and the Turner Center for all of the good work that really helps us as legislators do the right policy. And again, I'll rely on you to make sure that we design a good program to use that $100 million that we've now authorized.
Thank you so much, Senator Skinner. You've done so much for housing. It's hard in one list to list all of the things that you've had your hand in or your name on. And we're very grateful for your leadership. We very much look forward to working with the relevant state agencies on the new funding, which is super exciting. We're also trying to have meetings with federal banking regulators to encourage them to get some skin in the ADU game. And actually, the response we're getting from the federal government is the same that you got from HCD and the treasurer initially. Oh, there's not enough interest. And so we're preparing to say, no, actually, this is sweeping the country. The headline today in Sightline Institute's Poor Housing magazine was, states have to intervene in zoning because cities can't do it alone. Right. So we're starting conversations all over, and we really appreciate your leadership. Casita Coalition supported SB 9, and many of our members have sent in support letters. So we value all these small housing forums, and the work that we do depends on the work you do. So, and we feel that way about our state government partners as well as our local government partners. We're here to help all of you and all of us do more, do better. And we really appreciate that partnership. So thank you so much.
And you're welcome, and continue the good work. And I look forward to continuing to be your strong partner.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thanks. Take care. All right. Next up are our main attraction. East Palo Alto is a small but mighty California city that has done some really deep thinking and innovating around housing policy in general, and specifically in the arena of ADUs and zoning reform. And our guest speakers today are two folks who are intimately involved in creating East Palo Alto's systems. Rachel Horst, the housing project manager at the city of East Palo Alto, where she leads the city's housing policy initiatives. And Derek Ouyang, who graduated from Stanford with a degree in engineering and architecture, and now is the executive director of city systems and a program manager in the Stanford Future Bay Initiative. Together, the two of Derek and Rachel have been working for a number of years on promoting accessory dwelling units as a naturally affordable source of housing to address East Palo Alto's housing crisis. And we are very honored to have them today and look forward to hearing their lessons learned. Welcome, Rachel and Derek.
Thank you, Denise, for that introduction. We are very pleased to present to you today. So this is just a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. I'm gonna cover some East Palo Alto specific context and hand it over to Derek, and then we're going to go over some of the overarching themes of our work over the past couple of years. So East Palo Alto, for those who may not be aware of its geographic location, it's situated here on the San Francisco Peninsula, adjacent to cities like Palo Alto, and Menlo Park. East Palo Alto is unique on the peninsula for a variety of reasons, among which that it's composed largely of communities of color and has since its formation. And many families have lived here for multiple generations. And it should be said, some of the original families, many of the original families purchased homes here because they couldn't purchase homes elsewhere because of enforced residential segregation from surrounding jurisdictions. That's an important part of East Palo Alto's history and really informed its incorporation in 1983. It's a relatively young city, and that principle of self-determination really lives on today. And as I said, many of these families are still here. Another pillar of the city's incorporation was rent stabilization. So the city does have that. However, it's important to point out that a large portion of the housing stock is single family. So a lot of these are still, left on the open housing market and are protected by rent stabilization policies. Another important thing to point out is that incomes in East Palo Alto are much lower than the surrounding counties. So the area median income is less than half in that of San Mateo County. We have a large number of renters, 60% of the population. We tend to have larger households and some intergenerational living. And those conditions create East Palo Alto's unique housing context. It also leaves a lot of families vulnerable to this housing market. It also created some conditions that led to the conversation on ADUs that I'm about to embark on now that really brought us here today. So in 2016, there was a spike in the number of code enforcement cases. A lot of buildings were red tagged due to being substandard and direct threats to health and safety. And in response to that, the community really rallied around that and submitted a concept paper to the city to say that we need to do something about this because families are being displaced. So as a result of that, the city created a concerted response, but also funds were set aside through a community benefits partnership with Facebook to bring in Rebuilding Together Peninsula and City Systems, which is Derek's organization, and EPA Can Do, a community development corporation in the city, to work with some of these homeowners, take on some of these cases and work through some of these code violations that we're showing here in these images. So these are some of the types of things that we saw. And it led in some cases to demolition of buildings and again to some displacements of families. So the city's response to this was to form a secondary unit and anti-displacement task force that consisted of a lot of community stakeholders in East Palo Alto, including city systems and other partners that you see here that joined later on. So I'm going to hand that over to Derek to explain how we got here today.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So again, I'm a lecturer at Stanford. I have a budding nonprofit that's been looking to get involved in community-based problem solving. And actually, I came into the story and onto the scene right at the tail end of 2017 and caught the last task force meeting that happened before a hiatus. But what I was able to see was individuals from all walks of life actively involved and passionate about housing, holding their city leaders accountable. There was a hiatus though in 2018, and my understanding, it was really a lack of capacity to have the kind of facilitation and conflict resolution that was necessary for this task force to succeed. But what came in its place was something I think was really important, which was a technical working group was formed. This is with Rebuilding Together Peninsula in the lead, and City Systems was able to play a small role in the role of design and data analysis. And this was a smaller group of organizations that had closer relationships with the city. And we were invited to meet regularly throughout 2018 and had a few grant-based mandates to do actual work on the ground, like legalizing some of those unpermitted garage conversions, and ultimately just building up a much more detailed systems level view of all the pain points. And I think that meant that we had actually a lot of progress during that time. And when it came back to near the end of 2019, we felt like we had an opportunity to reconvene the task force and have conversations staged very much in the flavor of what the technical working group had been doing, catch them up to speed on what we had been able to complete in terms of learnings on garage conversions and ADUs, and invite them to bring all their thoughts together again for a final recommendations report that would be the kind of last artifact of all the work that had gone into the community process. I've just put the link to this report in the Zoom chat for all attendees, and we're going to certainly skip some of the details to get to the broader implications, but you are welcome to read that in further detail. So that report ultimately was completed and put before City Council and was a kind of baton also to the next initiative, which was kind of the technical working group becoming more formally a broader EPA ADU initiative. In the report, we sketched out really the consensus built across this large, diverse body of stakeholders to try to map out what we saw as the system problems around housing. So for example, in a diagram like this, which is further explained in the report, we're trying to map out all the different housing starting points you can have in the red where there's a problem with housing, a conflict you're experiencing, and map out all the ways we would like to be able to take folks in those conflict situations over to the right side of the diagram where there are satisfying conclusions. But in practice, what we had found as we started to sketch this out were all kinds of roadblocks in that process and all these interweaving decision points. And at the same time, then we were able to really focus our attention on the key nodes in which we could make strategic interventions to try to alleviate those roadblocks. And that's like the little yellow bubbles you see here, which ultimately relate to a big list of detailed strategies across 10 chapters. This is the kind of stuff that ultimately fills the report that I've shared in the chat. So this is the outcome of that community process by the end of 2019. And from our perspective, it was a roadmap sketched out of key strategies that community groups, community members, and the city can work on together moving forward that mostly relate to second units, but you can see how broad our view of what was at that time at the end of 2019. For example, there's an entire chapter on vehicle management because we saw that that was inextricable from talking about housing. There's also a chapter at the top right on regulatory reform, and our hearing of potential state law was definitely accounted for here, but was only one piece of a really, really big puzzle we'd created. By the time state law came around at the start of 2020, we were also able to show early successes across a number of different fronts in this larger roadmap. For example, the bottom left chapter, it's called ADU Accelerator, but that's basically streamlining. And we had been working, as mentioned before, on taking some active unpermitted units and really having a public documented process of what does it actually take to take that to compliance. And of course, some specific households and families were supported along the way, but this started to set the stage for templatized drawings in the future, discussions of peer approval, which we'll come back to later. Another kind of success early on was definitely in the area of outreach. Given the diversity of the community, as Rachel had mentioned, it's important to get this right from a cultural sensitivity perspective and to just make sure that these places feel like safe places for discussion around really sensitive issues. So we staged a few of these events at churches and resource fairs throughout 2019. And that included postcards that would actually go out to individual addresses. And we actually, with our data analysis, were able to kind of predetermine what ADUs you could and couldn't build, but then have all that information in English, Spanish, Tongan, Samoan, relevant languages in the community. And when they would come to physical events in 2019, we had the ability to do one-on-one consultations in which we would guide them through what was zoning law at the time. And we had built some of the earliest stage web tools where you can type in your address and get all that information ready to go. Nowadays, we've got great companies like Symbiom who can take that mantle forward and provide even more robust versions of this kind of technology platform. And then one last quick example of what we had already been doing at that time, building out that support system. This is, in my mind, the kind of Avengers of nonprofits that can support ADU development and really be advocates for tenants or homeowners. And the kind of thing we've got going on in East Palo Alto is all these nonprofits are talking to each other and also in close touch with the city through the technical working group. We've at least mapped out all the ADUs we're actively working on and can see how they relate and learn and share knowledge and resources across these different organizations. One in particular, EPA Can Do, is underway with an important program called Can Do ADU, which, as you can see here, is the kind of thing where you're just available to walk a homeowner from the very, very first inklings of I might want to do a formal ADU project all the way to leasing and management moving forward. So that's the kind of stuff that we'd say it builds off of that earliest task force of the community and takes that mantle and moves forward with this really multi-pronged approach. So what's actually happening in terms of ADUs? Now I'm going to start to show a little bit of data here, and I can't help but do that because City Systems fundamentally just does a lot of data analysis. So we're looking at counts of ADUs here year by year, but then there's 3 different colors for each grouping of a year. Red means that an ADU was applied for but hasn't been approved yet. Green means it's basically approved, but it's still being constructed. And blue means it's actually completely constructed and leased out. So you can see there's been ADUs built since 2016, 2017, but I want to focus our attention on 2020 because, of course, 2 big things happened in 2020. One is state law, and we would expect that state law did move the needle on the number of, say, formerly unpermitted units that could be legalized. So I think just seeing the number of the amount of columns here and how high they are means all across the board there was movement on ADUs, which is a good thing. But why is green the biggest column, which is to say that they were approved but not yet built? Well, that's probably COVID in 2020. So we're seeing things that make sense as a signal here. And it does seem like there is this push, this opening of doors, a floodgate potentially opening in East Palo Alto. But then what about 2021? We're over halfway through 2021. This is data very, very recently pooled. And it looks like there aren't that many that have actually been fully built or even approved in 2021. And actually seems like there's the most ever that are just in queue waiting to be approved. And that's not to mention all the other ones that are still being constructed from the past. So something seems to be potentially getting in the way now. And that doesn't bode well for what we would all want to see happen, which is at least hitting state or city strategies like the affordable housing strategy of getting at least 50 in the next 5 years. But I think we would all expect it to not just be like that, but to accelerate given all the work we've been doing collectively. So this is a troubling sign, at least an early sign, and makes us start to wonder if maybe this is not moving as quickly as we would like. And that just reminds us to look back at the bigger picture here of that roadmap that the community had put together. And it's fair to say that actually most of these things that we had set down on paper in 2019, we haven't really made a dent on, maybe even haven't had the capacity to try to take on yet. But where we've tried, we've noticed that the roadblocks we expected have been bigger than we thought. And there have been more roadblocks as well. And that's really become the tone of conversation now to figure out, despite the great successes of the past 2 years, what are really now the devils in the details that are getting in the way of real ADU acceleration? Kind of as a summary of what we've gone through in this prologue, we started with a really community-driven process in East Palo Alto to see a deep housing crisis, understand the system behind that, and then build together a multi-pronged, multifaceted, collaborative approach to start to tackle those. And then we had some good news along the way from the state in terms of removing at least one of the big barriers around legislation. But I think the theme really is what we had already identified before, which is it's way more complicated than just the kinds of things that were fixed with state law. And that's the devil's in the detail we're working on now. And I think it really comes to a head in small cities like East Palo Alto, which will explain why we think that's the case in the rest of this presentation. And really, we think this matters to others in the audience, because if it's happening in East Palo Alto, it's probably happening elsewhere. And it probably would have always happened because of just how complicated these issues are. So hopefully we can learn something from this experience now, this turn and this inflection point to really get back to that ground level work that is really necessary. So with that, we're going to now jump into 3 quick avenues here in acts. And I'll start off with talking about local policy reform. What I mean by that is the state law happened, but then all cities that were not in compliance then had to update their local ordinances. And that is an important decision node that every city faced. For East Palo Alto, before 2020, basically of the 3,800 or so single family parcels, there were straight up restrictions on what ADUs could be built. Only in the green parcels, which are 5,500 square feet or over, could you build attached ADUs. And then only in the smaller set of blue parcels could you build detached at all, because you were then of a sufficient size. So that was the landscape, which was making it hard for many, that was the first problem. You couldn't even legally build an ADU. So as you would expect, the kind of thing that state law ended up doing was, all residential parcels can do at least some kind of ADU. And then in the details, that means you can build up to 800 square feet. And that right can't be taken away by local control. But there is still a room for local decisions. For example, I'm showing here a 1,200 square foot ADU. State law, as you might know, was written in a way that basically leaves the door open for up to 1,200 square foot ADUs. But then individual cities can choose to maybe even go beyond that or claw back a bit. And so you have some discretion in the range of 1,200 all the way back down to that floor I had mentioned of 800 square feet. East Palo Alto already had 1,000 square foot ADU ordinance pre-2020. So a big question was, what's East Palo Alto going to do? Keep that on the books or change? Make it potentially even more restrictive now? So it is basically the case that a 1,200 square foot ADU like this has never been possible in pre-2020 either. And that means a large 3-bedroom kind of unit is harder to build. Here's another kind of example of floor plans that EPA can do in particular makes use of, where you've got a 2-bedroom, 800 square foot option on the left, and then you have a 975 3-bedroom option on the right. And the real debate is not whether you can build the one on the left, because state law was basically allowing that. What it really came down to was whether the kinds of larger ADUs like the one on the right would be possible at a parcel by parcel basis. So the nonprofit community was recognizing that this was a kind of decision point that would affect individual homeowners, and wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that choice that would be made by city council in 2020. And we tried to educate the public and really everyone on the real decision point, which then gets into all the more in the weeds zoning decisions, which is hard to trace exactly how that affects individual homeowners, right? So for example, here's like a way, if you're familiar with zoning standards, to really encode what the state law was really talking about at the end of the day, the things that really affect where and what you can build. And city staff at the start of 2020 was basically already holding their ground on what had basically been there in the past already, which is discrete other zoning standards that meant that on a parcel by parcel basis, maybe you couldn't actually build as big of an ADU as you would like. We tried to frame that as a public conversation in 2020, of course, all over Zoom. That was, hey, the public, be aware of these possible things that can affect what you can build in the future. And we want your input, at least to understand where the public is at. And we saw a large majority generally supportive of state law as opposed to the more restrictive city law. But then we saw many other diversities of spectrums on here in terms of residents recognizing the complexities of this issue, for example, relating back to traffic and parking and so forth. So after a public engagement process and lots of people submitting surveys and a lot of data-driven analysis that my nonprofit did as well, and presentations in front of city staff and planning commission and city council, long story short, the question on whether the final local ordinance would be more like state law or more like this local control ended up being a little bit more like local control. And maybe Rachel, you can speak a little bit to what that actually meant behind the scenes and from the city's perspective.
Well, I think this example certainly illustrates the position that city staff and city electeds are in. We are ultimately accountable to the community, and certainly a lot of ADU proponents came out because of the public forum that you helped to create, Derek, and other partners. At the same time, there was community opposition, and those voices were also there. As you said, there were concerns about parking. There were other concerns about just having large units on parcels throughout the city. And those concerns also had to be taken into account. I think this is a common refrain for cities, even in cities that are quite housing ready, as they say. So I think both sides of the story are completely accurate, and this is the equilibrium point that we find ourselves at. So I'm going to pick it up here to discuss some of the financing concerns related to ADUs, and touching on, once again, these points that the task force already brought up in their report back in 2019. So this is just showing that all of these are interrelated. I'm sure all of you are familiar with these factors, and we would like to hear your perspective on these, actually. But just illustrating that we're trying to touch on the levers that we can to actually make a difference in reducing costs. And so one of the simplest things we can do, or any city can do, is when we have nonprofit partners like City Systems, is to build a permit fee calculator. This just draws from our master fee schedule. You put some specs in, you find out approximately how much you're going to owe in terms of permit fees. This creates predictability and transparency for the homeowner, but it also created a conversation on the staff side as to why we are applying the fees that we are to ADUs, and consider if we want to make any sort of reductions or tweaks. And we actually did make some tweaks, and I anticipate that in future years, we're going to make additional tweaks specifically as it relates to ADUs. This is just a slide to show that ADUs are also viewed in other contexts of affordable housing, including in our inclusionary housing program in the city. The city council actually considered this recently for a small townhomes project of 2 units. The developer provided 1 ADU instead of paying an in-lieu fee. So can ADUs actually be an alternative to an in-lieu fee payment? We get a unit that comes online, it's deed restricted affordable. We didn't get the funds as the city, but those funds take a while to be rolled out to subsidize affordable housing. So ADUs can actually maybe reduce the total development costs, but still bring an affordable unit online. Touching once again on the Can Do ADU program, this is so vital to have in East Palo Alto because we were able to build upon this. As we said, there is a dedicated staff member at EPA Can Do that works directly with homeowners to conduct a lot assessment and take them all the way through to lease up, but they're providing technical assistance and they're helping to navigate the system. What we did is we brought in another program to piggyback on this. you'll be familiar with the Cal Home program, HCD program. We received a $2 million Cal Home grant specifically for ADUs and JADUs. So this is a deferred payment, low interest loan that comes in as a gap loan. And this is because we recognize that there was a gap in financing. So as Senator Skinner kind of touched on earlier, this is one of the biggest challenges that homeowners face. So yes, we can work with them during the lot assessment. We can help with design, with finding an architect, with getting getting through the permitting process. But the homeowner still has to secure financing. And even with the Cal Home program, they have to secure conventional financing. This is a big challenge. And so bringing in something like the Cal Home program, it fills that gap to an extent. But the problem is we don't know always what the total project cost is going to be. And is that gap going to actually be filled fully by the program? I should say this is also for lower income, so 80% AMI households and below to receive that gap loan. So not everyone who comes to the Can Do ADU program will receive a Cal Home loan. But some certainly will. And because we have the infrastructure there already with this program, we're able to do something like that. Of course, this doesn't solve every problem in the system, but we do hope that it will help to lead to higher production and also serve this housing need in the community. So just to sum up, where this brings us to in terms of an expanded understanding of the cost challenges that we face. Again, you're going to recognize all of these, but some of these are in the city's control and some of them are not. So we're going to work on the ones that, we really believe we can make a significant difference on. For example, with fees, we have this conversation now on a regular basis of putting the need for city revenue against, the need for reducing the cost of the homeowner, or potentially to the developer in the inclusionary housing context. Maybe the need to treat ADUs as their own housing type and think about how we apply fees separately to them. In terms of financing, I don't need to go over this again, but yes, especially lower income homeowners have a hard time securing financing for ADU production because they can't take into account future rental income, because credit's an issue, etc. So it's great that there might be a loan product out there, but again, we tried to come up with some of our own ways to kind of fill that gap and come in where possible to help make it happen for even low income homeowners. In terms of delays, you have to actually be a project proponent. Homeowners have to be there and on top of their project because, time, of course, is money, and not knowing that the ball's in your court, that you need to resubmit plans, or the plans are being held up by some outside agency approval process, or the project got sort of re-reviewed in the field and you have to pivot. All of these things have to happen, and the homeowner has to be, take ownership of that. In terms of soft costs, there's not a lot that we can do there, but Cal Home does allow for reimbursement of some of the plans permit phase. And we can also try to work in some pre-approved or templates, which we're going to touch on later in this presentation. And then finally, construction costs, there's not a lot that we can do about. Of course, materials costs are quite high. Finding a contractor is very challenging. And doing things like using modular units, or again, like these pre-approved plans, can help to reduce some of those costs. But we're really looking to those other areas, those other levers as a local government. So in terms of what else we're doing now, beyond just looking at making a pencil, we're looking at streamlining. And what do I mean by streamlining? We're actually actively engaging, again, going back to this original task force report, we're actively engaging these partners like EPA Can Do and city systems. We used part of our SB2 grant to invite them in, to hold up that mirror to us. It was a formal invitation, to kind of get a little beat up and take a look ourselves and say, how can we internally improve our processes and streamline ADU production as the city, knowing our limitations.
Appreciate Rachel framing it that way. From my perspective, being invited, it was like jumping into a rabbit hole of all the things that actually make streamlining really complicated. So one really, maybe the elephant in the room would be just by the premise of it, you might want to do streamlining from the city of East Palo Alto's perspective, but every ADU project has other authorities that are part of the process that can either streamline or block ADUs or delay ADUs. And there are definitely other authorities in this diagram, which I won't get into details on, but are not just standing their ground against the principle of streamlining, but even like the constitutionality of 2020 state law. And I'll leave the audience to look up particular board meeting agendas, maybe from last night at your own risk to learn more about that. Turning to the local level though, maybe the first question is, people have brought up the idea of specialized staff for ADUs. That's how you can help with streamlining. From my experience, I've worked with great staff. I work with folks like Rachel and others. But that's my view of kind of who's even potentially at the table to consider that. Maybe Rachel, you can shed a little more light on just how many people are in that room.
Yeah, the purpose of this visual is just to show what you see, that is us. There's not really a lot of redundancy. There's not a lot of reinforcement. We're it.
Yep. So that's, of course, one thing that makes a lot of potential options on the table a little bit more difficult. Another area would be what I'm calling here consistency of building code interpretations. And that's in distinction from zoning interpretations, which of course can have their own inconsistencies and challenges as well, but have been largely addressed by state zoning legislation from a kind of top-down perspective. No such top-down change, as far as we can tell, is really affecting the potential for inconsistency at the building code level yet. And the illustration of this problem is something like pre-approved ADUs, which I know many folks are thinking about already. And naturally, we would see this as a viable solution for streamlining in East Palo Alto as well. We've been able to piggyback off of a county-wide initiative led by an organization called Horst, which is a local housing trust. And they got Air District money to hire an architecture firm to create 4 different ADU designs and make them available for free. And that's the project. Now, the free ADU plan does not necessarily mean pre-approved ADU plan. So really the next step is the messiest step, which is to actually get individual jurisdictions like the city of East Palo Alto to be a potential pre-approver. And the kind of thing we're seeing as mixed results is there's reluctance at the building department level to the principle that you might get one of these 1 month and have an interpretation. And then a month later, you'd get the exact same drawing. But then the principle that seems to be in place as inertia is that you have to start from scratch there. You can't benefit from having pre-interpreted this in the past. So that's something we're seeing. We're also seeing at the field level that whatever the permit department had approved, inspectors may come in and then kind of start from scratch again and have their own potential concept of there's no pre-approval there, but they might also be in stark contradiction to what the building department had approved. So for these things to be happening, which I'm sure everyone has their own stories, horror stories in the field, which I'll spare you from specifically in East Palo Alto, that seems to not bode well for anything that would sound like pre-approval and for a lot of concepts of streamlining. I think it goes back to the nuances around building code interpretation, which Rachel will share a little bit more on as well.
Yeah, it's exactly as Derek says, and it can vary from individual to individual, but we've identified that we think this is really also a systemic problem, because as an inspector, as a plan checker, you look at the code and the code changes, first of all, so it evolves. And there's also a very rational risk aversion involved in just quote unquote, making the call. This is the same thing that we saw in planning departments before the state law change. You want to be able to make a determination that you can stand by and be as consistent as possible with and not be challenged on. And when it comes to the building code, we're talking about health and safety. So that objective is arguably, even higher than at the planning stage. And we think that this is something that is really influencing the behavior of not only what we're seeing in East Palo Alto, but jurisdictions.
Getting close to the end of our list here, and just one other category I want to emphasize is the lack of enforceability, which is to say you can have legislative change, but then when the rubber hits the road, it's like the procedure and protocol level of individual staff members in any department. And just having state laws doesn't beget the other. So let's take one example, like review times, which the state law does have something to say about. We were able to recently do hot off the press data analysis, looking at permit data for ADUs that in the last few years were applied for but not approved. Take this with a grain of salt, because of course there can still be errors in our analysis or clerical errors in the data, but you're seeing dots higher or lower depending on how long the review took. And then they're kind of categorized into different reviewers. And at the very top in the dashed line is like 365 days. We actually just capped the review time that could be had here, although some were years in the making. And then the lower dashed line is a theoretical 60-day threshold, which is part of what state law is asking reviews to take no longer than. Now I'm just going to highlight that the kind of thing we can see with this data is, particular authorities like the building department, the sanitary district seem to be having longer than average review times, and many that are just ongoing now. Like in theory, all the teal ones, there is a homeowner out there that's still waiting for a review back from these entities. So that suggests that the enforceability problem that I'm illustrating here, but also just keep in mind that it's amazing that we can get this data in the first place because of the technical working group kind of relationship and trust built, that the city is willing to give this to us so that we can show back what's going on here. And that's of course an important aspect behind the scenes here to even be able to identify these issues. And now I'll just cap off this list with where we started, which is that was all inside of the city, but then there's still the problem of many authorities get involved in every ADU project. So we see this really as a thing to worth spending time on and attention on and tackling these whatever way we can, which is work like we're doing internally, but sometimes we might need the help of statewide coalitions to get involved in some of these issues as well. So let's just go to the epilogue here in conclusion. And thanks so much for taking the time to hear from us today. And we look forward to the conversation. Just want to emphasize that we've only touched the surface of the many other things we've been thinking about when it comes to barriers. And that just speaks to how broad and diverse and multifaceted we have been from the start. And that's, I think, a unique quality to the work we've done in East Palo Alto. But there's a lot ahead of us, as we can tell. And of course, we couldn't include many other details and thoughts into this presentation across the wide spectrum of ideas. One last kind of silver lining, I think that community-driven effort and reputation continues to reap benefits from potentially philanthropies and big tech companies recognizing how important the problem is and what they can do to solve it or be part of the solution. And at least that means money, right? So a recent success has been the Facebook Housing Innovation Fund has supported what we think is a great network of that local engaged stakeholder group. For example, Symbiom is getting supported to build out and ramp up their technology platform to be available for cities like East Palo Alto. We've got SOUP and EPA Can Do, other support system nonprofits that are getting supported here. And then United Hope Builders and my own organization, we're getting kind of more seed funding for developing actual ADU technology. So in City Systems case, for example, a concept we're exploring is how to take an average garage and fit it out so that you can then have a prefabricated core. You can see the blue element here, actually plug in and just make the garage conversion process a lot easier. So there's a technology implied here, but also a process that hopefully can be streamlined, maybe even pre-approved to some degree in the future, and then affects the bottom line, makes these just easier to do for homeowners. So that kind of work has a narrative thread back. Final takeaways here, and we maybe leave it on this slide for a bit as we transition into Q&A. Zoning reform, something we have so much thanks for folks like Senator Skinner for, is a necessary but insufficient step to unlocking real ADU change in our communities. And that's partially because local government is limited in resources and political will. And there can be this kind of two step forward, one step back kind of phenomenon we're experiencing in local communities. But we think what is so powerful is what Rachel will follow up next in key takeaways.
Yeah, we really just need to prioritize, as we call them, the inside-outside partnerships, especially in smaller cities where we can't do it on our own. We have to invite in nonprofits to work with us. And what this does is it keeps ADUs on the table, as we say, as a ready-made solution, so that when the problem arises and we're ready to address it, it is there, and we have partners who are able to actually help us realize that.
Yep. And then as a final note, we are strongly in support of a coalition like the CETA coalition, because the more of these inside-outside partnerships happen, then the more we can all learn from each other as well and be connected through this network. So we really appreciate the opportunity to bring our short story to this group today. So hand it back over to Denise and Jared.
Thank you guys so much. This is, for me, I began my career in local government, and everything you say is sort of wired into my DNA. And it's like the devil, you just forget that all those problems are problems because that's what you grew up with, right? That's the culture that you're used to. So it's fascinating to hear someone shine a bright light on all of those problems and identify those problems. And I think in a way, this is the next task of all of us, Casita Coalition, of our members, and many of our members, if not all of them, are right now engaged in removing what I call the second generation of barriers, where we took care of the zoning barrier, which was essential because without it, these other barriers didn't matter. You couldn't get past the zoning barrier to even have a conversation about coordinating different divisions or competing priorities among separate entities in local government. So I think that this takeaways is very helpful and will be helpful not only for other cities thinking about this, but for academics and others who analyze local governments and think about how to make government more efficient and more productive. And I think the final lesson here is that housing is really hard. It is really hard to have enough housing. The barriers are super complicated, and we all need to, I think you said, we all need to have these inside-outside partnerships at a local level, statewide level, in order to make any headway. So thank you for this. And with that, I'd like to introduce our Q&A panel. Why don't we take this down? We can always put it back up again. Today we have doing questions and answers from their background and experience in government and planning and accessory dwelling units. I'm joined by a couple of Casita Coalition volunteer leaders, including Jared Basler, who is a member of the Casita Coalition board from San Diego, and Caleb Smith, who is current one of the chairs of our ADU Finance Committee. So he's obviously deeply enmeshed in the financing problems that we're all facing. And then also Sonia Sinha from Housing Trust Silicon Valley, one of the sponsors of today's webinar, and also a thought leader in the whole space ADU finance, working with us on our ADU finance subcommittee at the Casita Coalition and trying to figure out what we can collectively do to make this stuff better. And I want to also give a shout out to Caleb and Sonia and the others who helped really tee up the ADU finance conversation for the state of California. Senator Skinner and Senator Hertzberg and Assemblymember Ting took that ball, but people at Casita Coalition prepped the case and explained why it was necessary and provided them with the information they needed to make it happen and get it into the state budget. So you guys have already done a great job, and we're grateful for all of that work and really look forward to today's Q&A. So with those introductions, I think I'd just like to open it up to the panel. Reactions to the presentation, questions for the panelists.
Yeah,
Jared, start with you.
Yeah, really appreciate the presentation, the thoroughness, and sometimes that's a great thing because it gives us a lot more insight and allows us to dig deeper into the actual, some of the nitty gritty. And sometimes you just answer all of our questions from the outset. So one thing that I thought was interesting and something that obviously we hadn't seen before as we've, kind of gone through your presentation is, really looking at that chart of where projects are getting stuck and how long they're getting stuck in. And I think that this is something that not just, small cities, but large cities as well, both with the change of processes that have happened over the last year and just in general, the processes by which cities are approving ADUs and approving building permits in general is one of the areas where we see so much diversity in process. With some cities requiring planning approval before going to building permits, some cities reviewing everything concurrently. I think it's something that when we look at the larger state level, it's really a challenge to have things like the 60-day, approval because we see that the diversity of processes just creates a giant cluster of stuff that can't be unwound as easily. But I wanted to kind of, hear from Rachel and Derek on where is your process right now? Are you guys accepting things digitally? Is it, I know some of the challenges with, some of the digital acceptance and, has created its own problems, but just wondering, what the process is. Are you guys reviewing concurrently? Is it, what's the process there in East Palo Alto?
Yeah, well, in terms of planning, it's not a concurrent review process. There is a separate review process, but it's very, very fast on the planning side. So I think, Derek, did you show the planning zoning clearance form? But basically, planning's entire review process has been put on a one page or maybe a couple pages. And when the development application is submitted, once that checklist is fulfilled, it just moves on to building. So that's why we really emphasize, building portion of this, because once it does get to them, there are still significant delays that really haven't been affected by changes in state law. And in terms of, to answer your specific question about submittals, yes, digital submittals are allowed, and that's something we had to pivot to during COVID. So it took a little while, and it definitely caused some delays. But now that is not a reason for delay. We also have people in the office who building techs in the office that will receive paper copies. So I don't think those are things that are contributing necessarily to any project delays or approval delays.
Just two more quick cents on the forefront of the challenges here. One is, I think we need to have more discussion on what it means for cities to be so low capacity that they need to have third-party contractors be involved in review, which just adds another layer of coordination that could be challenging, but could also be an opportunity for more standardization. But that's tricky in East Palo Alto for different reasons. And then across those other authorities that have to approve, we've noticed just strange coordination problems, like multiple entities all need to come up with their own validation of what the square footage existing is. So they all call the county assessor's office asking basically the same question. And somewhere in there is an opportunity for some kind of streamlining or digitization of the process.
Yeah, I definitely see that, across the state, I think we've kind of taken a step of like, all right, let's look at best practices and policy. Process is, again, talking about like second generation barriers. Process is so important to actually making these work. And I think a lot of cities have the same exact kind of, if you look at the data from, cities across the state, they'll have very similar data as far as, how many applications came in, how many got approved, how many got finaled, and, see that, disparity amongst different departments and different authorities. And so I think, really the next generation of, this journey we're on is to really start addressing the process inconsistencies. And, as CASITA moves forward and looking at best practices, really focusing on the best practices around some of that process work. And so I know that, it's difficult, a lot of cities, it's, there's technical barriers, there's just historic process barriers, but really understanding that like things like dedicated teams in larger cities or concurrent submittals, concurrent reviews, and even beyond that, allowing resubmittals to individual departments as opposed to waiting for everything to come out. Because at that point, a lot of cities, what we're finding is, they have one department that's vastly understaffed and behind on everything. And when we look at like the easiest way to address some of the timing concerns is letting applicants resubmit to individual departments so that there are not, you're not being held up to start the resubmittal process until you get that final review back. And then of course, the coordination between outside agencies is always difficult. And that's going to take a lot more thought process to try to untangle.
So I want to invite in Caleb, who works with the County of San Mateo, one of the other agencies whose logo appeared on the coordination slide that Derek prepared. Caleb, questions, comments, thoughts? You're still on mute. I want to make sure you get, there you go.
Sure. Thank you, Denise. So the County of San Mateo overlaps with the City of East Palo Alto. I work for one of the County of San Mateo's affordable housing initiatives called Home for All. We work closely with both Rachel and the team at East Palo Alto, and also with Derek and City Systems and some of the other partners that were mentioned here, because we really admire and appreciate a lot of the fabulous work that's happening in East Palo Alto. And both East Palo Alto and Derek's team are also very helpful to some of the conversations that are happening in other cities in San Mateo County and more broadly. So we really appreciate that. I think that the work that Derek and his team is doing to try to see where there's opportunities to strengthen those connection links in terms of communications and such is very promising. We look forward to hopefully supporting that work too. And I suppose a question, as we like to think about how other cities can try to replicate some of the good work that's been done here, is in my experience at least, unusual the depth of collaboration between East Palo Alto and its community partners on the topic of accessory dwelling units. That kind of inside-outside partnership is a term I'm going to have to borrow. So I guess a question from the city perspective, Rachel, what do you think are some of the things that East Palo Alto did to sort of create good conditions for that kind of partnership? And I guess a question for Derek on a related note is, for other cities that are out there who would love to work with somebody like you, but don't know somebody like you, where are some places they might be able to look for this kind of assistance?
Is Rachel still on? Did we drop her?
I'm still on.
Oh, okay, good. Perfect. Rachel.
I think I'm still on. Okay.
Yeah, you swear, I can hear you loud. All right, my screen's screwed.
So in response to that question, I will say I joined the city in 2019, and these efforts were underway for a very long time before I joined. But what I've observed and taken part in is that there are very strong community, like EPA can do, very strong community organizations, exceptionally strong community organizations in the city. And I think that since the incorporation of the city, that collaboration has been there between key organizations and the city. Now, City Systems wasn't there in 1983. So it's not to say that hasn't been an evolution of partnerships and that new partners haven't come in and others have gone. But I just think that's part of the fabric of East Palo Alto. But, we're trying to make these more universal lessons, right? So, okay, if you don't have these types of relationships in your particular jurisdiction, what do you do? And I think that it's within the power of staff and the elected officials to look outwards for that help. And I have to say that, also it's sort of self-selected groups that are out there, these nonprofits. They happen to be there. When I said ready-made solutions in that last slide, that's kind of what I meant, right? They're there, they're already standing there, just waiting in the wings with that solution. And when it finally occurs to the city council and the city staff to get around to addressing that topic, they're already there and ready to go. And I think that's what I've seen on a repeated basis here.
I'll just quickly give us easier answer to your first question, Caleb, which is what the city of East Palo Alto did really well was hire someone like Rachel and someone who could be in that position to really cross boundaries internally and extend that and open that door outwards. For the community side, I do think it's there can be variation in the technical ability to get into those discussions and talk in the language of city. But I think there's a first step that the cities can take, which is to do that opening of the door. I think there's a little bit of build it and they will come kind of phenomenon that can happen here. And then you can have the Casita Coalition behind the scenes as a kind of incubator and accelerator to make sure that when there is a catalyst possibility, that there's a lot of resource available to really bring together the necessary community representation, technical ability, et cetera, at the local level.
Great. I want to make sure we get Sonia in. Sonia, you've been watching from the nonprofit partner standpoint, the changes in East Palo Alto in the county. Do you have reflections on the presentation or questions for our presenters?
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Rachel and Derek, for a great presentation. We work, just so everyone knows, our geographical limitation for our program and ADU construction program, East Palo Alto is obviously part of our geographical reach, as well as everybody in Santa Clara County. So we are very interested and we work closely. We've actually had a chance to make some presentations with EPA Can Do, so I know they're a great organization. I just had one particular question, which I thought was very interesting for Derek. Could you talk a little bit more about your A-Duo, the plug-in garage ADU solution that you're offering?
Sure. Yeah, what the grant really allows us to do is do a demonstration project of this kind of construction method, which is unusual because otherwise you would just be building directly inside of the garage. But there's a concept of you kind of prepare the canvas of the garage, and then you have something that's really standardized that could be plugged in. What we think makes that cheaper than usual is you reduce the amount of complex site work that happens on site. But then if we make that design open source and really completely free and available to the public, we hope this is one of those phenomena that can happen in industry where then that gets to be its own ecosystem with lots of architects and manufacturers and contractors understand the good ideas inherent in the plugin solution, but can riff on it and innovate on it. And those are all naturally more affordable because the designs were basically open source to start with. Now that's all conjecture. So the funding basically allows us to try that in communities that are close to Facebook campus, where you have conversations with homeowners in East Palo Alto and North Fair Oaks at the moment. But I think at the end of the day, we're all waiting to see what actually became of the process. We're going to make those very well documented in terms of videos, and that's going to be on aduo.org. But yeah, it's an open question whether this will actually be a paradigm shift or just a great idea that is going to be available on the table for homeowners to consider in the future.
Well, I've had that idea for a long time, Derek, so it'll be a paradigm shift for sure.
Hope so.
Well, and the reason Casita Coalition's first code wonk guidance memo was about garage conversions is it's very complicated from a code standpoint. A garage was not built to be a house. Mm-hmm. All the wood members are undersized, everything about it doesn't meet the building code for a house. And it seems like a straight up idea, and a lot of illegal ADUs are people just bootlegging in housing into a garage that's not safe. So this is a safe, standardized unit that solves the complexities of retrofitting an existing not to code structure. I think garage conversions are hugely popular for homeowners. It doesn't take up their yard. It's a building that is underutilized except for junk storage anyway for many families. I know that's how our garage was used for a very long time. So this could be really very helpful to lots of folks. And I think whatever work is happening in the standardization realm, whether it's a plug and play backyard ADU, which a number of companies are doing, or a plug and play garage conversion module, I think these all help.
Yeah. And I think most importantly is that open source component, because that's in stark contrast to a lot of private industry action in ADUs. But I think we're just showing what that can look like at this community scale we've been talking about this whole time, which is that because we decided from the get-go that this would be more of a social impact venture that just puts good ideas out there. That means we can engage the community from the start of that process. And really, this whole idea has been inspired by seeing how critical garage conversions are in the DNA of East Palo Alto. So I think just even the design process and how inclusive that is, and how we're touching on the actual livability concerns that homeowners have, I suspect it feels very different the way we can do that out in the open and in public versus, you know, protected trade secrets of different companies that are competing in the market. And you know, both may be important in the ADU ecosystem, but I felt like there was a big gap on that more social enterprise side.
Yeah.
Derek or Rachel, do you guys have questions for any of your interview panel members? I know you work a lot with Sonia and Caleb. Maybe you want to put them on the spot since you have the mic, as it were. No, all right.
I do have one other question. I kind of want to explore the topic a little bit, which is a lot of cities, you know, take the approach of looking outward first at what the problem is. And it's refreshing and interesting that, you know, you're really holding the mirror to yourself to understand where the inefficiencies and how your processes contribute to, you know, cost and time and all of that kind of stuff. Can you just talk a little bit about like what that process was like and how, because a lot of cities aren't, you know, whether they're large, small, I don't know if it's just they aren't thinking about it or if they want to pass the blame, but like, it's just really interesting to me that you guys have taken that approach.
Well, as I said, the streamlining is formally under the umbrella of our SB2 grant. And that was actually one of the first things that I did when I joined the city is I applied for SB2, like many other staff members. And I have to say, I remember going over the scope for this proposal. And it was the result of a lot of things that were already in motion. So some of that was the task force, the secondary unit and anti-displacement task force's work. We were already kind of steeped in that. And streamlining had already been, for a long time, I think, a theme that had come up. Then there was the external sort of statewide streamlining effort, not just with regard to EDUs, but with regard to housing in general, and we were tapping into that. And then also there was some pretty visionary staff on board. So he's our assistant city manager now, but Patrick Heisinger, who was the community development director at the time, was also very plugged into this and working closely with groups like EPA Can Do. And it was really just having that, I think that combination of, okay, there are available funds for this thing called streamlining. We've already been hearing about this for a number of years. And yeah, okay, now we're staffed up enough that we can handle this. And it was just a natural fit.
Yeah. I think definitely, you know, one of the things is involving the outside groups and the people that are utilizing the process. That's something that a lot of cities maybe don't want to do. And I don't know how we get beyond that, but, you know, it's something where, you know, we see the inefficiencies on our, you know, in the process that we go through every day. And it's refreshing to be invited to the table and to talk about those things rather than, you know, a lot of the, you know, streamlining efforts have been focused around, you know, solely around the idea that, you know, architecture costs too much and takes too long. And because of that, we're going to give these pre-approved plans and not understanding, you know, what goes into why design costs what it costs, and, you know, the time and effort to get through some of these more difficult processes that are different in every city. So, you know, it's always refreshing to hear that. I'd love to see more of that across the state because that's really where we can get to things that are impacting all building projects, all housing projects, as opposed to just hitting that little ADU spot where, you say, it's the lip service versus actually policy and process that is intended to succeed.
Well, and I think, to your point of everyone on the call, it's really hard to do that. Even cities that have hired a housing ombudsperson whose job it is to reorganize all the city departments to talk to each other more efficiently. A number of our major cities in California have done that. They still have not succeeded. There's so much that's embedded in the culture of departments that is very hard to unwind. But I think, every journey begins by identifying the problem. And I think what really a helpful and unique contribution that East Palo Alto is making to this conversation is to go deeper into identifying the problems and to call them out clearly. And I think a number of other cities have highlighted similar things. San Jose has worked on having these interdisciplinary teams to do ADU review to help unlock the interdepartmental log jams and to keep the departments working together in coordination. Other cities have designated staff people that only do ADUs, and every ADU goes across their desk, so you don't get differences by inspectors or by building, plan checkers who do it differently because they've never seen an ADU before, even though the city's approved 5, 10, 100, 1,000 of them. So I think lots of cities are trying, but the depth of the analysis about the problem set is important. And just Casita Coalition intends to wind up all these conversations with the issuance of a best practices guide that identifies what these next generation problems are that all the cities around the state are working on, and some of the solutions that people are proposing to them. So these ideas will get captured in our best practices guide, and we'll invite all of our presenters and interviewers to participate in an internal peer review of that to make sure we've accurately captured and are reflecting some of the thoughtfulness that went into your work and into these presentations. So I see that Derek and Rachel have done a great job of answering all the Q&A questions as they come up. Thank you very much for that. Are there any final questions or thoughts from the questioners? Jared, Caleb, or Sonia, do you have any final questions for our panelists?
No, I just really appreciate the depth of analysis and the depth that you guys have taken this, especially as a small city. I know it's difficult, and we just need to get the larger cities that have the money and can do it all as well to follow suit. So you've been an excellent example for other cities throughout the state.
Sonia, Caleb, any final thoughts to share?
I think Jared did a pretty good job of summing up. I think it's remarkable what East Palo Alto has accomplished and is continuing to accomplish. We certainly will look forward to continuing to work with them closely, hopefully to help support their efforts. And what they're doing is already supporting our efforts. So I think that what we didn't talk so much about today but also East Palo Alto has been a really great partner to San Mateo County. And that's something that we really appreciate. In terms of how that's been able to support the broader conversations about second units here in San Mateo County. So that's another really great partnership and collaboration that I hope other cities and counties might be able to look at and follow up from.
Great. Sonia?
No, similar thoughts, just like Jared and Caleb expressed. It was a great presentation, and City of East Palo Alto is doing such a fantastic job, and we want to be here. We are here to support them in every possible way because it's part of our jurisdiction as well. When we want to see other cities, it would be great if we can have more and more cities at least following their example. And it's like a roadmap that they've out for us, so which other cities can hopefully follow. So thank you all.
Great. And Derek and Rachel, thank you so much for the thoughtful presentation and the great conversation. These kinds of conversations are really critical to advancing the removal of barriers to the ADUs, but also all of these small housing forms that weren't widely allowed until very recently. And so we're all grappling with what these changes mean and how best to seize the day, seize the moment, and make it work as best we can to solve the many crises that are facing our cities: housing, homelessness, climate change. So I'm really grateful for your work and for all of us working together to continue to improve quality of life as we can for all Californians and in all of our various communities. So thank you for that work.
Thanks so much.
Well, that winds us up for today, and I would like to invite our guests to join us. Our last summer webinar, the summer ones are especially hard for folks, will be Friday, August 27th, featuring the City and County of San Francisco. You can register on the Casita Coalition events page or search Casita Coalition ADU. And then we look forward to highlighting the City of Oakland Friday, September 24th. In the remainder of the year, we'll look at San Mateo County, so Caleb will come back. And I think we'll wind up the year with some reflective look backs on hot topics that people had particular concerns about in November and December. So we'll share those soon. If you like what we're doing here at the Casita Coalition, we invite you all, if you are not already members, to please join us through our website, follow us on social media, like us on social media, and just stay in touch so that the coalition of the willing on housing gets bigger, deeper, broader, and more powerful, and provides an important and compassionate voice in California for lots of different ways to approach the housing crisis that involve actually providing more housing. I think that, as Senator Skinner pointed out at the outset, many Californians are organizing themselves very thoroughly to be against new housing in many forms, including against small housing and ADUs. So it has never been more important for us to work together across the great geography of California and all of our various diverse communities to make sure that our voices are heard as well. Thank you so much for our panelists, our speakers, for Senator Skinner, for our keynote, and we will see you next month. Take care. Bye-bye.